Felagund himself often returned to visit men, and many other elves out of the Westlands, both Noldor and Sindar, journeyed to Estolad, being eager to see the Edain, whose coming had long been foretold. Now Atani, the Second People, was the name given to men in Valinor in the lore that told of their coming, but in the speech of Beleriand that name became Edain, and it was there used only of the three kindreds of the elf friends. Greetings friends, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Tomorrow is March 25th, marking the destruction of the One Ring and the holiday of Tolkien Reading Day, so I hope you all find time to escape to Middle-earth tomorrow as well. Today we'll be continuing to explore the timeline of Middle-earth as we look at the Tales of the Silmarillion. Our Timeline of Arda series details the major events of Tolkien's works as they happen chronologically, and if you haven't seen the previous episodes, I will link the first video of the series and latest videos in the description and cards above, as they are necessary to understand this episode. I'll also go ahead and link other videos that relate to today's topics to add more details as well. Today we will talk about how the second-born children of Iluvatar came to Beleriand, and how they met the firstborn children, the Eldar. Now there will be a lot of detail in this video, so please feel free to ask questions or look into the Silmarillion, which is this video's source, for more information or clarification. Thank you all for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. To set up our main discussion, I must also briefly mention some of the other events of the early First Age in Middle-earth. After the first battles of Beleriand and the coming of Fingolfin's host from the Helcaraxe, Dagor Aglareb, or the Glorious Battle, was fought, and the Siege of Angband was set, and Morgoth was forced to stay within Angband or suffer the fury of the Noldor under the command of High King Fingolfin, or the Sons of Feanor. The Noldor who followed Fingolfin, and those that followed the Sons of Feanor, were yet sundered in friendship because of the burning of the ships at Loskar, making the Noldor traverse the Helcaraxe. However, after Maethros was captured by Morgoth, his friend Fingon, the son of Fingolfin, would go to rescue Maethros, who was bound to the Thangorodrim, the volcanic mountains outside of Angband. However, the elf was unable to reach Maethros, and believed he would have to end the life of his friend with an arrow instead of letting him suffer there. But Thorondor, the Lord of the Eagles, would carry Fingon to his cousin, and he would be forced to cut Maethros' hand off to free him. But the son of Feanor was saved, and much of the anger between the followers of Fingolfin and those of Feanor was mended. Eventually, the elves Turgon and Finrod were given dreams from the Vala of the Sea's Ulmo. These dreams would begin to drive the elves to build their kingdoms, Gondolin and Nargothrond respectively. Gondolin, the kingdom of Turgon, would be built and completed by 1/16 of the First Age, and Nargothrond, the kingdom of Finrod, who was aided by Thingol of Doriath, would be founded in 102. Ultimately, these three elven strongholds of Gondolin, Nargothrond, and Doriath would be the most renowned of the elven homes throughout the rest of the Silmarillion, while there were also other places of the elves, such as in the havens of Sirion or in Osiriand, near Ered Linden. Again, these places were established or made stronger during Morgoth's time in Angband, while he was under the siege of the elves. The events of Gondolin in its early days would mostly concern Maeglin, the nephew of King Turgon, and the son of Iul, the Dark Elf, and Erethil. I'll have to do an epic character history on Maeglin to really get into detail, but all we need to know now is that after the sister of Turgon, Erethil, went away from Gondolin for a time, she would come upon Iul in his woods of Nan Elmoth, and they would have a son in 320 of the First Age. Eventually, these three elves would go to Gondolin. Iul would try to murder his son Maeglin, but would kill his wife instead, and so Iul would also be executed by the king's orders. Maeglin would remain in Gondolin by the king's side, and ultimately cause the discovery and downfall of the city later in the tale. Besides this, don't worry too much about Maeglin in the timeline until we get to discussing Gondolin once again. I just wanted to mention him for chronological reasoning. Concurrent with the building of Nargothrond and Gondolin, in the land of Doriath, the realm of Thingol, the Sindarin king would learn of the kinslaying of his relatives among the Teleri at Alqualande, and he would ban Quenya in his lands, and his anger at the Noldor who slew his kin would result in him being of little aid to the Noldor throughout the First Age, but he would still be friendly with the houses of Finarfin and Fingolfin, for these elves had atoned for their evils. Now that we've talked about the state of Middle-earth at this early time in its history, let's jump to the focus of this video, the meeting of men and elves, and the coming of the former into the West. We'll see why Finrod Felagund is one of the kindest elves of all time in my opinion. After the creation of Nargothrond, Finrod was given the name Felagund, meaning Hewer of Caves, in Sindarinized Khazd-dûl. In the days of the Long Peace, while Morgoth was yet kept in Angband, or so it seemed, but after the initial emergence and defeat of Morgoth's dragon Glaurung in 260, Finrod would at one point in time journey east in Beleriand to hunt with Maethros and Maeglor, but he grew tired of the hunt and instead wandered the dwarf roads alone towards the arid Linden, the Blue Mountains. However, he would see lights in the distance, and fearing that they were a band of orcs from Angband, he would approach slowly, only to find singers of a strange language and people. He would watch and listen for a long time, waiting until they fell asleep. Then he would take up the harp of Beor, the leader of this group of men, and awake these people with song. The men would awake and listen, almost thinking that they were caught in a dream hearkening to one so fair, believing at first that this was one of the Valar that they had only heard of. Eventually, Finrod and the men were able to communicate, for the language of these men had roots in the words of the Dark Elves, who had stayed in the East, and since all languages of elves had one origin at one point, and the elves were great at learning new ways of communication, the elf was able to talk to and understand these men. We eventually come to learn that Beor and his house are the first group of men to come over the Blue Mountains and go into Beleriand, and they escaped a terror in the east. Now, this is the year 310 of the First Age, and men had awoken in the year 1 in Hildorian, and since then, a shadow had crept into the east. It seemed that Morgoth had learned of the awakening of men from his spies and snuck forth from Angband to see if he could corrupt or destroy the race of men in its infancy. But he was afraid of the union of the Eldar and went back to Angband, leaving his servants. While many men escaped such servants, and even with the shadow of Morgoth upon their hearts, they came westwards. Thus the house of Beor would go forth from Assyriand, as the green elves of that land did not like their ways of hunting and cutting wood, and these men would go to Estolad, the encampment, and would eventually go to Dorthonion to be ruled by the descendants of Beor, for Beor himself would become a friend and servant of Finrod by his own choosing. From this kindred of men would come Beren, who would meet Luthien and go on the quest for the Silmaril. After the coming of the House of Beor into the west, the Haladin, or House of Haleth, would next come into Beleriand, and they would be more reclusive, and eventually they would live in the forest of Brethil, and would be joined by the Drúg, distant relations of the Druidain. They would only come to live in Brethil and guard the Teiglin after the elves under Carenthir, son of Feanor, helped to save them from an orc raid, which was an attempt to wound men from Morgoth. Finally, the third house, the House of Marak, or better known as the House of Hador, would come into Beleriand, and eventually they were given the land of Dor Lomin, south of Hithlum. Hador would enter the service of Fingolfin, and he would become the lord of his people in Dor Lomin. From this line would come the men Húr and Húrin, as well as their sons Tur and Turin respectively. After the coming of men into Beleriand, there were some men that left the elves to their battle with Morgoth and went back into the east or south, but many of the men stayed and regarded their new friends among the Eldar with honor. As for the elves, obviously Finrod loved the race of men, for he was the first elf of the Noldor to encounter them, and he would continue to aid the House of Beor for the rest of his days, even eventually going to his doom to save Beren. Fingolfin also regarded men with much affection, sending messengers welcoming them into Beleriand and giving them land in which to settle freely and rule themselves. Thingol, however, did not fully appreciate men until after the deeds of Beren, son of Barahir, and wished for none to enter his realm, but already Melian, his wife, knew that a man would one day enter the forest, that man being Beren himself. And after the deeds of Beren, Thingol would open his heart and his realm to other men such as Turin Tarambar. But ultimately the race of men would come to learn much from the Eldar, and the Edain, as the men of Beleriand were called by the elves, and eventually the Dunedain, or men of the West, would be the closest allies of the elves for the rest of the history of Middle-earth. Many men would serve alongside or under elves in battle, and the two kindreds would become close friends, even if men were now entangled in the doom of the Noldor. The elves would also see the mortality of men and wonder at it. But after the realms of men were established, Morgoth would break forth from his siege in the Dagor Bragolok, or the Battle of the Sudden Flame, but we shall discuss that more in the next episode of the Timeline of Arda. From the first meeting of elves and men in Middle-earth, we see the strength of companionship and friendship. If the Eldar were evil of heart, they would have conquered the men to rule them, but the goodness of the elves is apparent in their deeds. It is important that we remember friendship and alliance is a chief goodness in this world that must never be corrupted. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this video with a friend. What are your thoughts about the first meeting of elves and men, and the coming of the men into the West? I think this is a renowned moment in the Legendarium, for it sets up how the rest of history will be. Let me know your thoughts, additions, and corrections in those comments below. Also, please consider checking out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and Patreon in the description. For just $1 a month, our Patreon will allow access to our Discord server and podcast, with the next episode of the podcast coming soon. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a fun video for April Fool's Day, so please head on over to the community tab to vote for one of those topics. Have a great Tolkien Reading Day tomorrow, everyone, and as always, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.